Well, I'd like to say welcome to Olympia, the home of the state capital. Olympia was originally named Chitwood, which is an Indian name for the place of the bear. And Edmund Sylvester is the one who donated the original 12 acres here for a territorial capital back in the 1850s. Oregon Territory was created in 1848. There was a treaty in 1846 called the Oregon Treaty, created the international boundary between British-held Canada and the United States, which is becomes Oregon Territory. In the 1850s, the people north of the Columbia River decided they would like to split from Oregon Territory. So they literally split Oregon in half. Washington Territory is created in 1853. The name Columbia was a proposed name by the pioneers after the Columbia River. Again, Congress changed that and named it after the first president of the United States, the only unanimous president elected in U.S. history. And that's how the name Washington came about. When Isaac Stevens was appointed as the first territorial governor, he came to the biggest town on Puget Sound. It was the one that's going to end up with the first customs house on Puget Sound. It's the first one that had large dwellings and buildings and what have you. So he came here and said, basically, we'll meet here first, and then the legislative chambers can decide where they want to go after that. So Olympia became the capital and has always been the capital, unlike some of the other states. But we've always been the capital of the territory as well as the state of Washington. The 12 acres here was donated by Edmund Sylvester if you will build a territorial capital on the 12 acres. And that territorial capital building was built in 1857. The territorial capital is now a temporary building being used now for approximately 4 decades, really getting dilapidated and old. The restrooms are in outhouses behind because it's still a territorial building even though it's 1900. The county courthouse was built in the late 1800s. And the county could not afford it. So the state was looking for a nice building to use as a capital building. And so the state bought the county courthouse. And then the county courthouse was added onto for the legislative chambers. So if you look at the building, it's Wilkinson sandstone from the front part, and the back part is Tenino sandstone. The old territorial capital stayed on the grounds up here for about 10 more years before finally they said enough's enough, and they tore it down. So that building was used until this building was completed in 1928. If you read a lot of the old journals, they always say what a magnificent site for a capitol building. It's up on top of a hill. It looks down upon the city center itself. You have Budd Inlet and Puget Sound. Off in the distance you have the Olympic Mountains and Mount Olympus in that complex. And so it's a gorgeous setting. The building was constructed between 1922 and 1928. Approximately 400 men worked on the building. Some of them were immigrants. If you walk up the steps, there are 42 steps because we are the 42nd state to enter the Union. The steps are made out of granite. They come from Index, Washington, which is up in the Cascade Mountains. The exterior sandstone is Wilkinson sandstone. It is just outside of the northwest corner of Mount Rainier National Park. The building is 287 feet tall from ground level to the top. We declare that it is the tallest masonry dome in the Western Hemisphere. The original design for the grounds here called for a handful of buildings and a grand staircase up from Puget Sound to here. That was the grand design. Grand staircase did not get built. We have a path that goes down there now that replicates that. And we have a unique situation because we not only have a Capitol building, we have a Capitol campus. We have 5 buildings altogether that were designed after the Capitol building, the classic Greek architecture. And so we have over here Supreme Court building over here, which has Doric columns. We have a building here as well. It's just an office building. We have 2 in back. We have a temporary building there that's actually now pretty permanent. It's called the Governor's Mansion. It was built in the early 1900s to have guests come from an exposition that was held in Seattle. And they chose not to tear down the Governor's Mansion. So it's still being used as a Governor's Mansion when the governor is in town, that type of thing. We have just walked into the state capitol building here in Olympia. We have come through the north entrance, which is the main entryway to the what we call the foyer. The foyer has 2 things that I think are outstanding to take a look at. One of which is the marble. The marble that you see in here is from Tokine, Alaska. It's Alaskan marble. The statues here represent the state of Washington, the Statuary Hall. The first one that we installed is Marcus Whitman, which is at the far end down there. And Marcus Whitman was a pioneer and a missionary and a doctor. And he came out in the 1800s trying to prove that you could take a wagon all the way across the continent. He later was a guide actually on the Great Migration of 1843. That statue is actually the tallest in Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. The second one is Mother Joseph. She was a young lady who was taken to a convent in Montreal, Canada by her dad. But not only can she do those female domestic chores in the 1800s that females were expected to do, she was trained to be a carpenter by her dad, which is highly unusual for a female carpenter. And she started schools and hospitals and orphanages. She went around to logging camps and mining camps on begging tours, begging for money to build these institutions. So that's Mother Joseph. She's now buried in Vancouver, Washington. We have just walked up our beautiful granite steps to the Rotunda. The Rotunda has several features I'd like to show you. One is the state seal. The state seal is polished brass. The original state seal was designed by Talcott Brothers Jewelry Store here in town. The Talcott Brothers are shown a territorial seal, saying, okay, here's an example, would you make a state seal for us? The Talcott Brothers basically said, that is extremely busy. We don't want to do it that way. It needs to be something simple so it'll last a long time. So they took a bottle, drew a circle, took a silver dollar, drew a circle, took a postage stamp, put it in the middle, and said, here's our recommendation. And of course, the postage stamp was 2 cents of George Washington. For all intents and purposes, our state seal has been the same ever since. It's been tweaked and altered. The state seal that you see here on the floor is the 1929 version. When you see our state flag, it is an updated version. There's some slight differences between that. I'd like now to tell you about the rest of the Rotunda. The crowning feature, of course, is the chandelier. The chandelier is 40 feet from George's nose to the acorn on the bottom. It's 175 feet from George's nose to the inner dome. That inner dome is plaster of Paris. It's attached to a concrete dome. And above that is a brick dome. And above that's the exterior sandstone. The chandelier measures approximately about 8 by 25 feet, and it weighs 10,000 pounds. It's the biggest chandelier made at the time, and again, it's designed by Tiffany's in New York. The dome itself weighs about 30 million pounds, and it's a rock, brick, and mortar masonry dome. This Capitol building has gone through 3 fairly significant earthquakes. One was in 1949, one was in 1965, and the other one was 2001. The 2001 earthquake, which we refer to as the Nisqually earthquake, did some major damage to the building. That it actually lifted the dome up and rotated it, and it actually moved 3/4 of an inch east to its location now, which allowed some of the columns to tilt. And so what they have done is they've gone back and retrofitted the building. It took approximately 2 years to do that, to the tune of $120 million. The building cost originally $7.4 million, but inflation. And they put a core through the columns and put a steel beam through the columns, in other words, to tie in the building all together. So hopefully this will not occur again. We have just come into the House of Representatives. Washington is a bicameral legislative state. Bicameral means a 2-house legislature, and every state in the union except for Nebraska has a 2-house legislature. The legislature here in the state of Washington is a part-time legislature. In other words, it meets for 105 days during the odd-numbered years and a 60-day session in even-numbered years starting in January, the second Monday of January. The House of Representatives here in the state of Washington has 98 members. There are 49 legislative districts, and each of these members are elected to a 2-year term. There is no term limit in the state of Washington. So in other words, these gentlemen or women can be re-elected as many times as they wish. That's also true for the executive branch as well. There are no term limits for governor. Architecturally in this room, what you have is French marble. The names of the counties are around the edges. There are 39 counties. They are paired by either being east of the Cascade Mountains or west of the Cascade Mountains. Since you can't divide 39 equally in halves, one county, Walla Walla, gets its own panel on its own. The Capitol building here in Olympia represents the unofficial symbol of the state of Washington. It represents their government. It represents the building materials that are inherent in part of the construction of the building, such as the granite and the sandstone, for an example. There are approximately 500 images of George Washington that you can find throughout the building. Essentially, when you walk into the Capitol building, what you're going to notice is George Washington's image on doorknobs. You're going to discover it on railings. You'll discover it in a bus that we have here out in the foyer. You're going to see a lot of symbols of the state of Washington, and so to me, that's what reflects the Capitol building.